Let's start with something a little lighthearted. This is my Deep Space Nine Lieutenant Commander Worf action figure. I love this action figure because one of his action accessories was his, and I quote, adventure bag. Notice it is a very bright pink. I cannot tell if Worf is going on an adventure or if he just cannot wait for the sale at Kato's. He's like, I'm finally going to get those shoes I've had my eyes on. Anyway, so today we're going to talk a little bit more about the historical context of what was going on. I'm sorry. Oh, gosh, guys, you have no idea. You have no idea how sick I've been. It's awful. Just absolutely dreadful, awful. Anyway, I need to find a way to do more of a discussion, but live concurrent sessions right now are just a nightmare. Like, oh gosh, there's so many problems with the live concurrent sessions. I need to do it, but I haven't decided which software program I'm going to use. We've been told not to use Zoom, which is really annoying because that's what everybody and their mother is using right now. Anyway, let's do a little bit more of the historical context around Africa and the Congo. Again, it might feel like I'm beating a dead horse a little bit, but the more you know about the history of Heart of Darkness, the easier it is to get into and understand why this book is so important and, in my opinion, good. Now, we're also going to discuss an interesting new literary theory today, which I think may be the basis for your final research paper. This is going to be a little draconian, but from what I've seen, in times of heavy, crazy, insane complication, being more heavy-handed with the assignments and being more like, no, do this, can help with the anxiety, because rather than having a whole bunch of freedom to talk about and do what you want, you know more specifically what you should write and what's expected. So I think I'm going to err more on the side of giving you direct instructions for the research paper as opposed to giving you more and more freedom. I might end up regretting that, but I think it'll make things a little bit easier for you guys. Now, the theory we're going to discuss today is called PostColonialism. Now, before we can get into a discussion of postcolonialism, we have to understand what colonialism was. Everything that I told you about the Belgian Congo last time, with all the horror and the abuse and the nightmarish stuff that was going on, that's colonialism. So post-colonialism logically talks about the world that we live in after the reign of the colonial powers. Now, just to give you an idea of how far-reaching this was, let's go even further outside of the Congo this time to see how this process of foreign powers coming in and running a country actually really laid the foundation for all sorts of crazy geopolitical nightmares, not just involving the rubber plantations in Congo, but a lot of times, I promise I'm going to stop snorting. It's so difficult right now. Good Lord. I think I got the thing, y'all. Anyway, now, I usually have this conversation with a group of people, which is going to be, there's going to be a lot of weird, unnatural pauses here. But so Britain and most of the European powers go out into the world, and they bring with them a heavy-handed colonial presence. And I mean, if you guys know anything about the history of the British Empire, there used to be a saying that the sun never set on the British Empire. They conquered the entire world for a while. So these places were far-reaching. They had an iron fist, right? They had an iron grip on these societies and these peoples. Now, you would be surprised to see how much of an effect this has actually had in our current modern day. This is the stuff that post-colonialism really concerns itself with. Now, I don't remember exactly all of the details with this story. It might have been Congo, but there was one particular instance with a European power that went into Africa as a colonial power. And if you look even to this day at the way some of the national boundaries are drawn in places like Africa, those boundaries can look very strange. all things considered. Those borders don't really make a lot of sense. They're arbitrary. Now, when you look at a place like the United States, the borders in the United States typically follow rivers and, very natural, sensical boundaries. When the colonial powers first went to Africa and they started dividing things up for themselves, how do you think they drew the boundaries in order to carve up the land? It wasn't in keeping in mind settlements of people. It was keeping in mind the location of resources. Different countries wanted to come in to different areas and take things like the potential gold mines, the diamond mines, the oil fields, the jungle, the rubber, all of these things. That's what truly demarcated the lines of the first African nations. So there was an instance where they were drawing a line for a country that was being carved out. And the lines of this country just jutted off crazy into one direction so that it looked like this nation had like an overgrowth on it, like a stick shooting out into another country. Why on earth would they do that? Well, the ruler who wanted that particular tract of land had fallen in love with a waterfall that existed deep in the territory of another nation. And so in the negotiations for how those nations were going to be laid out, they carved out a path that this ruler could follow deep into the territory of another nation so that he'd be able to go to this waterfall without necessarily violating any of the other sovereign borders. That's insane, right? Think about how crazy that is. Now, there's a correlation of this to this day when we talk about gerrymandering. When we have counties and political districts that are drawn to try to mess with voting records so that a certain political party will win, but we're not going to go there. That'd be a whole other conversation. But that was just for a single waterfall to suit the whims and the needs of a particular ruler. Imagine what happens if we draw societal, national boundaries around things like coal fields or coal mines, or where there's a particular type of wild game they would like to hunt, or the diamonds, anything, all this stuff. If you're drawing the boundaries on those terms, who gets left out? The people who live there, right? It makes a lot more sense to draw a national boundary with the ethnicities, the tribes, and the people in mind, because those are the ones who need to be catered to in the future. You ever wondered why, when you look at the Middle East, you have pockets of certain ethnicities or religious groups tucked into an area, and they hate each other? And they're constantly at war with each other. This is why. Colonial powers coming in and drawing those national boundaries looped together minority groups with majority groups and did not actually keep in mind maintaining national boundaries, like with attention to the indigenous tribes who lived where they lived. And so now you've divided all these people, you've put them in nations together, and they have to get along. And in a lot of instances, they're just not, right? They have differences that drive a bloody wedge between them. Now, the thing that makes this even worse, and you don't see this come out directly in Heart of Darkness, but this is something that was very much a historical side effect of the stuff that you see going on in the book. If you draw national boundaries and you lob together a minority group and a majority group who hate each other, and you want to maintain control of that group, who do you give power to? You give power to the minority. If there is a small pocket of people who are weaker, less numerous than the majority, You give them a bunch of weapons, put them in charge, let them oppress the majority, and then that ruling party that you've created is 100% dependent upon you. If you withdraw your support from them as a colonial power, then they will be cannibalized by the majority. This was something that colonial powers used over and over again. They let the smaller minority groups that had been locked in together with the larger majority groups, they let them have power. And basically they got drunk on that power, got it in their heads that they were superior to the majority that they were allowed to rule over. And that causes horrific ethnic strife. How many of you guys have ever seen the movie Hotel Rwanda? How many of you guys know about the genocide that occurred in Rwanda between the Hutus and the Tutsi ethnic groups? That is a direct result of that type of governance. When Rwandan colonial powers, when colonial powers from Europe came into Rwanda, they gave ruling power to a small minority group within the Rwanda area known as the Tutsis in order to rule over the majority Hutus. Once, and I believe it was French too. I'd have to go back and double check that because I think it's French. They speak French in Rwanda, I believe. Now, if again, they propped up these Tutsi ethnic groups. Once those colonial powers leave, who's going to protect them from the wrath of the majority group that they've been oppressing with the aid of the colonial powers for so long? That happened directly because of the history of that colonial oppression. They basically encouraged that. Now, postcolonialism as a theory basically looks for the after effects of colonial rule in these parts of the world. You can see this also in Iraq. They did the same exact thing there, right? Iraq has two rival religious groups. You have the Shia Muslims who, it's been a long time since I've read up on Islam. And if I get this wrong, please forgive me. But I believe the Shia Muslims believe that Muhammad's son, or nephew or cousin, his kinsman, Ali, was the rightful ruler of the religion, whereas the Sunni Muslims believed that it was supposed to go to like the ruling council. They didn't believe that it was supposed to be a a birthright type thing. Anyway, the actual difference between them is, dang it. This is why I shouldn't live stream. The actual difference between the religions, it's a schism between the religions. There's a great deal of conflict between them, kind of the same way that Catholics and Protestants had a conflict for the longest time. But this is what facilitates the conflict there. In Iraq, they are majority Shia. And the colonial powers basically put a Sunni government in charge of a Shia majority. It's the exact same thing that happened in Rwanda. Now, we go into Iraq, and again, this actually kind of helps make a lot of this crazy geopolitical stuff make sense. Because when we invaded Iraq, we had no idea what kind of, terror was about to happen, because that's a hornet's nest that was created more than 100, 200 years ago, because they basically left that place unbalanced. Iraq was drawn as a nation, not around these ethnic groups, but around oil. And so you've got these two groups trying to share this piece of land, and they don't get along. And so if you go in as an American power and you're like, we're bringing democracy, you just completely took all political power away from one group that had been historically propped up. Now, what does all this have to do with Heart of Darkness? This is a function of the abuse and the darkness that is being injected into this African power. The Congo has been left in absolute, utter political chaos ever since Belgium left. Now, think about this for a minute. I hear a lot of political rhetoric, and I might get in trouble for going in this direction, but hey, what am I going to do, right? We talk a lot about personal responsibility. We talk a lot about the fact that countries need to learn to help themselves. And you see this a lot when we talk about giving countries aid and all that. The colonial powers basically came into these areas and devastated them, absolutely destroyed them, and left them with a political system and a boundary, a national identity that was going to undermine them and break their legs for generations and generations. Think about the hell that happened in the Congo Free State, where all these children lost their hands, where so many people in the Congo were amputated. What does that do to their prospects, their economic prospects, their personal prospects? Damn, what does that do to your mental health growing up in an environment like that? The Congo has gone from all sorts of different political revolutions. It's at a constant line of totalitarian governments, which kind of makes sense when you're dealing with the chaos that's been created. Now, a lot of people step back and they're like, oh, the Congo, don't ever go to the Congo. That's a bad place. Is it a bad place, or is it what we left them with? There's a great deal of empathy that you should feel and you should work for when you consider the world that these people were left with. And how do you build a life for yourself out of hell? Now, if you ever want to see some really interesting political stuff, look up the history of Zaire and the history of the Congo. I mean, just the inflation and the constant revolution, renaming, redrawing of political districts. It's amazing. It's like a whole world history just tucked into one place. And all of it just comes down from this history that's just, a womb of nightmares. Now, as we read this book, I want you guys to think really, really hard about colonialism and post-colonialism itself. I'm going to leave you guys with a bit of a discussion question. We're right now in the book, riding in the boat, right? We're going down the river. As we get farther and farther into the center of the jungle, as we get farther and farther from the trappings of civilization, things get worse and worse, darker and darker, until we get to the heart of it, until we get to the actual source of the thing. This is one of those things that's quite possibly one of the most common pop culture tropes I've ever seen in my life. The fact that we begin in civilization, and as we go deeper and deeper, we lose touch with civilization. We lose touch with our humanity, and we drift further and further into chaos, and we lose the center. Think of how many movies have shown that. Think of how many stories explore that. How many video games explore that theme, starting within relative calm and journeying closer and closer to that heart of darkness. That's your discussion question for this time. This book is so influential for so much pop culture. I want you to think really hard and see if you can come up with a couple of examples of where you've seen that theme before. I could help, but I kind of don't want to take one away from you. So remember, think about the movies you've seen, with the video games you've played, the books you've read. There might even be a few in this class where we start from a place of stability and move to chaos. Even that very general description of this could be helpful. Let's do some comparative analysis. We'll follow up more with the politics of this next week, and we'll there's so many interesting, horrific places we can go. I love this book, but it just, man, it's rough stuff. Anyway, be safe. Hope things are going well. Toodaloo.